you're on a PC and you're having issues, you can technically just work in the main CSS file, okay? That's not ideal, that's not eventually where we want to be, that's not industry standard, but for the sake of having it work right now, you can do that, okay? All right. I'm going to go ahead and create or customize my own hotspot. So I'm going to tie into the class hotspot, which already exists in the HTML. It's part of the code that is given to me from that online editor. I'm going to use the background property, and I'm going to specify an image. Eventually, this is going to end up in the CSS folder. So to get from the CSS folder to the images folder, I'm going to say // images, and I'm going to look for an SVG file called hotspot.svg. Background images in CSS tend to repeat, or they do repeat by default, so I'm going to say no repeat. I'm also going to position it in the center. If you were to look in the images folder, you will see an SVG called hotspot.svg. Okay? And it looks something like that. You are not going to use that SVG for your own submission. Okay? You're going to customize and make your own little hotspot SVG. Yep?
It's showing, it's not pulling up the images, and I think it's because I'm not in the right file when I just do // How do I go farther up?
How do you mean? Here?
Because right now when I do // it just gives me options for inside the SAS.
Oh, /images/
Right.
/images/
But it won't let me reach images because it's technically outside of the SAS folder.
Okay, so here's the thing. Right now, we're inside the SAS folder in the components folder, right? So if I'm typing like // images hotspot, the code editor is not going to automatically make that connection for me. Okay? And the reason for that is when this gets exported, it's going to end up in the CSS folder. So I have to map the path as if I'm mapping it from the CSS folder, because that's where this is eventually going to end up. Okay? Yep. Okay, so I'm going to do a few other things. Just going to remove any border value, set that to 0. I'm going to set a custom width and height. And I'll leave it at that for now. Okay, and I should see something like this. So the hotspots have now been customized. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is pull in some of the CSS from the generated code that I was given. So I'm going to go into my model folder, and I'm gonna grab that file here, style.css, or styles.css. Gonna open that up in VS Code. So there's a few things I'm gonna grab out of this file. I don't need this, I created my own hotspot. But I am gonna grab this rule here, hotspot not data visible. And hotspot focus as well. Yep,
Did you find that CSS folder?
yep. So earlier in class, we downloaded the model zip folder, okay, from the model viewer site. And in that model folder, okay, it gave us some pre-generated CSS along with some images and other things. So I've just opened up that file called styles.css. And from there, I'm just gonna grab these two rules, hotspot not and hotspot focus. I'm gonna copy and paste them into my SAS file. And when I look at that now in my browser, I'm probably not going to see too much of a difference. But these are basically rules for what does it look like when I tab over. So when I hit the tab key, see it's got that blue border. And what does it look like when these icons or these hotspots go out of focus? So when they go out of focus right now, they're appearing as these kind of translucent squares. Maybe I want that. I don't know. It's up to you to decide. Maybe you want that as a hint to the user that, hey, you know, maybe you should do something because there's these invisible boxes. Personally, not a huge fan. Okay, so I'm actually just going to say opacity 0. And maybe if I want to brand the focus so it looks a little more to like the colors that I'm using, I'll just change that to orange. So let's say E89 E36. Okay, so those squares are just gone, and when I tab over these buttons, it's a orange square around it now, okay, to indicate that's where the user is. Next thing I'm going to do is go back to that styles.css file, and I want to pull this rule here for hotspot annotation. Okay, so I'm just going to go and grab that. And I'm going to bring that into my SCSS file. hotspot annotation is those boxes, those descriptive boxes. So if I go back now, I see these little things. And again, you're free to style these however you want. I'm going to go ahead and create a couple of my own custom rules here. So I'm going to hook into that class of hotspot annotation, because eventually it's going to be filled with text. And sorry, I should have a P after that. I'm going to say color. So I want the text in the annotation box to be a dark gray. I'm just going to set the line height property to be 22 pixels. And I'm going to set the font weight 300. There's also going to be an H2 tag inside of the hotspot annotation. So I'll create a selector for the H2. And I'm just going to set the font size to 18 pixels. And I'll set margin bottom to 5 pixels. And visually, we're not going to see much difference because we don't have any text in here yet. But there is one other thing that I want to do in our CSS file, and that is to customize the loading for the progress bar. So I'm going to go into my dev tools here under inspect. And if you're in Chrome, I'm going to go under network. And there's an option here for throttling. And what throttling allows us to do is to simulate slower internet connections, okay? And that's something we're going to make use of quite a bit moving forward, okay? So right now, again, I'm under the network tab and it's set to no throttling. So if I want, I could set it to simulate, let's say, a 3G network, okay? And I'm going to refresh the page. If you watch, you should see a loading bar at the top. Okay. So there was a small gray loading bar at the top. I don't know if you caught that or not. Okay. I want to stylize that gray loading bar. You got to really watch, but it's there. There it is at the top, okay? Okay, so I want to customize that to look more like my brand, right? I want it to use brand colors and that sort of thing. Now, if I go to the documentation here for the model viewer, again, I can see some of the different things that I can customize.
Excuse me, Professor, what about the previous tab, like we saw in the tab?
This one,
Yeah,
what about it?
the previous,
I can't hear, can you speak up?
So first no struggling, and after this you click somewhere and it became green, or like in the corner, like
brings up so
What was that? Okay, so here we're talking about? Yeah, so okay, I went into DevTools. And if you go under the network tab here, okay, you should see a little tab here called throttling. Currently set to no throttling. And what you can do again is simulate different presets. So in this case, I just went to 3G, and then I refreshed the browser.
okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, no, sorry, I misunderstood, but yeah, that's an important thing. And when I refresh, it simulates it loading on a 3G, and we actually see the loading bar. So now the question comes, well, how do I modify that loading bar? I just kind of ended up doing a search through the documentation. Let's see. Somewhere in here. I came across this here. So it said scope your CSS to model viewer : part default progress bar to change the styling of our default progress bar, okay, without replacing it wholesale with a slot. So most common would be probably changing the background color, the height, the width, and margins. So basically, I'm going to use this selector to modify the progress bar. So into my,
Where did, how did you get to this site?
So it's just modelviewer.dev. And I just went to the documentation, so the API reference, yeah. And then this basically gives you, yeah, again, information about the things that you can edit, setting up staging and cameras, all that sort of stuff. I just did a quick search for progress bar. Okay, and it gave me this information here about progress bar. So I'm going to go back to VS Code and customize the loading bar. So I'm going to use the selector that they said, which was model-viewer, : part. Inside we're going to say default dash progress dash bar. And inevitably the question comes up, Marco, what the heck is the part selector? Okay. So we'll talk about that. So when you are using a web component, okay, and you place that web component in your HTML, additional things get added to your code, okay, because you're using a pre-built web component with pre-built functionality, okay. So what gets put into your HTML is this model viewer, okay? And this model viewer essentially has its own DOM, which is known as a shadow DOM, okay? And inside the code for that model viewer is an attribute called part, okay? And it's the default progress bar. So basically what we're doing is setting up a CSS rule to style this custom web component that has the part default progress bar, okay? The best that I can explain. So all we're gonna do is say, okay, progress bar, we want you to have a height of 30 pixels, and we're gonna change the background color. Once again, to match that orange that we're using. And if I go back to Chrome, and I hit refresh, I should see a larger orange loading bar. Not in that case. Let's try that again. Reload. Alright, let's see. It's just the right bar going there slowly. Why is that? Model dash viewer part default dash progress dash. I don't see why that would be. Oh, I got, yeah, progress. That should be progress. Small typos, small typos. Now the progress bar is orange. Okay, so I had a typo. Okay, so we've done some things to customize it. We've got a custom loading bar, we've got some custom hotspots. Okay, so we've got just a little bit more to do in the HTML, and then we have to tackle everybody's favorite part, which is JavaScript. Okay, so I'm going to go here to the HTML, and I'm actually going to get rid of here at the bottom the AR prompt and the prompt to view it in your space, because in this particular example, we're not working with AR. Okay, so I'm just going to get rid of that. And then I'm going to move up to my first hotspot, hotspot 1. And you can see we have the div with the class hotspot annotation. Okay, so those are those information boxes. So we're just going to fill in a bit of text right now. So inside hotspot 1, I'm going to drop in an H2. And I might say something like noise, canceling, microphone. And then I'll drop in a paragraph tag. Yours doesn't have to have this exact text. We're just trying to get an idea here. So I'm going to say noise. Canceling, microphone, and a rear paste. To detect outside noise. Okay, so in hotspot 1, inside of the div with the ID or class or a hotspot annotation, I added this H2 in this paragraph. If I look at it in my browser, boom, there it is. Okay. Now, we don't want it there all the time, okay? We want to add some interactivity, but we'll get there. We got to finish filling out all these boxes first. So I'm going to do that a couple more times. I'm going to go into hotspot 2, and I'm going to add an H2. This time I might say comfortable fit. Throw in a paragraph tag. Say something like 3 pairs of ultra thin silicone tips are and then I've got 2 more to fill out. So I'm going to go here into hotspot 3. And just say 360 audio. And I'll say 360 audio. Places, sounds, all around you. Just keep it simple. And then one more in hotspot 4. And I'll say ultra fast charging. Say something like, charge your earbuds in 30 minutes or less. Okay, so again, for your projects, it's going to be up to you how many hotspots you have. You should have 3 at minimum, okay, at least. And what it is you're going to highlight on your earbuds and the text that you're going to write. Okay, so now I've got this happening, which I find to be a little cluttering, right? I don't want all of these there all the time. I'd rather have it so if the user hovers over a hotspot, they see this information. So let's say I've styled it, I'm happy with the way that it looks. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my CSS now. And again, it's here that that styling is happening for the box. So what I'm going to do is set it to be invisible for now. So I'm just going to go up here and I'm going to say visibility hidden. now comes the JavaScript part. So I gotta start doing, or I should be doing, some paper planning, okay? Just trying to sort of think this out logically, okay? Okay. So, the users are going to be interacting with these hotspots, okay? So I need a way to collect all of these hotspots, okay? So more than likely, I'm going to need a variable to collect the hotspots. And if I'm selecting something in the DOM as a group versus singular, what do I typically use to select them? Yeah, so most likely I'm going to be using query selector all. Okay. So I'm going to gather up all these hotspots, and I need to do something. I need, like, how is the user interacting with these hotspots? What are they doing? Yeah, okay, so they're hovering over it. So I'm going to need some events or some event listeners. Okay, so probably like mouse enter, mouse leave. Okay. What do I want to happen when the user mouses over a button? So I want to show the annotation box. What do I want to happen when the user leaves the hotspot? Hide the annotation box. And I know, or I should know, that probably means two functions. Okay. Here comes the trickier part. I gotta figure out which hotspot the user has hovered over. Okay. Okay. And there's a couple different ways I can do this. Okay. And again, this is where you get this thing with JavaScript where you can solve things in multiple ways. Okay. It just depends on your knowledge, how your brain works. Me, I went with the event object. Okay. You could also do this, and you'll see that it's probably posted to the course homepage already, using the this keyword. Okay. There's actually multiple ways that you can do this. Now, when I first started writing and working with JavaScript and I was going through tutorials, the event object kind of like perplexed me. Looking at people's code and I see E sometimes, and I see EBT sometimes, and I see event sometimes. And I'm going, what is this? Where is it coming from? Why is it named differently all the time? This makes no sense to me. Okay? And it wasn't until I really kind of researched what the event object was that I got an understanding. And it does kind of come from nowhere. The JavaScript interpreter creates it behind the scenes. So every time an event occurs, behind the scenes, the JavaScript engine creates this event object. Okay? And we can capture this event object. Okay? And the way that we capture this event object is as the first parameter in the event handler. we'll look at that in the code. But basically, you can capture it as EVT, or event, okay? And why the event object is important is it contains all sorts of information about the event that occurred, okay? One of the things that we can find out about the event is which hotspot the user hovered over, so we can grab that, okay? So we're gonna grab that information and we're gonna say, oh, okay, the user hovered over hotspot 1. That means that we want to show that particular info box, okay? So again, I haven't really written any code, but what I've done is I've just kind of stopped, paper planned it out, wrote out some kind of rough code and ideas, and this is now where I'll start to actually code it out. So off to my JavaScript file I go. So as I mentioned, I'm going to create a variable, and I'm going to call it hotspots. Just like I said, I'll use the document object, query selector all method, and I'm going to select everything that has the class hotspot. And just to make sure that it's working in the way that I think it's working, I'm going to console log that and make sure that I have it. Okay, so I've got my variable to collect all the hotspots. I'm going to check my console and make sure that that's working though. And I can see that I have a node list, okay? Which is basically a collection of all the buttons, okay? And a node list is almost like an array. Okay, it's got all these slots that are holding the different buttons. Okay, so that's good. Next thing I need to do is add event listeners to these hotspots. Okay? So I've got this collection of hotspots, and I need to add event listeners to that collection of hotspots. How am I going to do that? What tool do I have? Not a dance move, folks. I have a collection of buttons in an array, okay, and I want to attach event listeners to each of those hotspots or buttons in the array. Am I going to write all those out individually?
For each.
Thank you. For each loop. We're looping, okay? We're going to use a for each loop to loop through that collection. Okay, so I'm going to take the variable hotspots and I'm going to use a for each method. that a for each loop works is it takes every item in the node list and places it in a temporary placeholder. So we've got our node list. Okay, and we want to loop through it. And what we're going to do is place each of these in a temporary placeholder, and we're going to run a function against it, or apply a function to it. Now, the method that most people follow is to use the singular version of what you're looping through. So I'm looping through hotspots plural. So I'm going to create a temporary placeholder called hotspot. Actually, I shouldn't have these parentheses here, these mustache braces. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is write an arrow function. So it looks like that. So loop through hotspots. Okay, loop through hotspots. For each entry in hotspots in that node list, run this function. And what do I want to do in that function? I want to add some event listeners. So I have to take the placeholder name, which is hotspot, and I'm going to say hotspot dot add event listener. And I can use mouse over, mouse out, mouse enter, mouse leave, okay? In this case, I just said mouse over. When that happens, I want to call a function by the name of showInfo. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to say hotspot add event listener, mouse out, hide info. Now, does that have to be named hotspot? Could I name it something different? Okay. So let's say I named it spot. How would that affect the rest of my code? Yeah, it would have to say spot dot event listener, okay? So whatever I use as a temporary placeholder has to match what I'm using in here, okay? All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and map those functions. So I'm going to say function, showInfo, and I'm just going to write to the console. And I'm going to say function hide info. And I'm also going to write to the console. Again, before I get too far into my code, I want to keep doing these checks, okay? and making sure that things are working as I expect. Because it's possible that if I botch something, these event listeners aren't going to be added and they're not going to be calling these functions. So I want to make sure I check. Yep,
You brought to dot log the show events.
thank you. Okay, so I'm going to bring it up in Chrome. And I should probably, I'll just set it back to no throttling so it doesn't take an hour to load. And if I hover, nope, I've got mobile no touch. There we go. I can see show info, hide info, call. Okay. So right now, every hotspot is calling these functions, which, okay, kind of getting there, but I need to know specifically which hotspot is calling that function. Okay. And that's where the event object is going to come into play. So in JavaScript lingo, these are known as event handlers. Okay. These are the functions that are called when an event occurs. Therefore, they are event handlers. By all means, they just look like regular functions, and they are, but they just have that name, okay, of being event handlers. And the rules for the JavaScript language say that I can capture the event object as the first parameter in an event handler. Okay. And I know that parameters go inside of these parentheses for functions. So I can technically name this whatever I want. I can call it E, I can call it EVT, or I can call it event. Technically, I can call it blue dog, okay? That doesn't have meaning. That's not really, right, a great way of naming things. So I'm going to capture it as E. And I'm going to console log out E. And what I get when I do that is this very large object with all sorts of information. The X and Y coordinates of where the user moused over. The target, so button hotspot. Again, there's all sorts of things that I can access. So it's very valuable. There's a lot of important information that we can capture from the event object. So one of the things that I'm going to grab is e.currentTarget. Not in there, sorry, that's going to be in the console. Okay, and now, when I do that, it's telling me which button I rolled over. Okay. So that kind of helps. But what I'm actually going to do is take it a step further and I'm gonna grab this slot property. Because in it is a unique identifier for each hotspot. So I'm going to say e.currentTarget.slot. Now I see hotspot 1, hotspot 3, hotspot 2. Okay. So I now know which one the user's hovering over. Okay, that's kind of helpful. So if I look at my HTML though, okay, and again, this was the way that my brain worked at the moment, or at the time when I wrote the code. I saw that, okay, so I can grab this slot and I know that the user has hovered over hotspot 1. But if I look, there's this div inside, and there's no real unique identifier for this div. It just has the class of hotspot annotation. And this was brought up by my students in another class. They're like, well, couldn't you give this a unique ID? And I could, okay? That's a thing. Again, there's many ways to approach it. But the way that my brain worked was, I'm gonna select the hotspot, and then I'm just gonna use a selector that says, select the immediate div that comes after it, okay? So that's what I did, is I wrote a selector that did that. Now this is where things get a little funky, confusing for some students. Okay. So I need to use query selector, right, to select that div to be able to show it, okay? And we know that query selector accepts strings, okay? Usually what we do is hard code in a string, right? Like #, header, or #, whatever. But in this case, we want the selector to be dynamic, right? So sometimes it's going to select hotspot 1, sometimes it's going to select hotspot 2, sometimes it's going to select hotspot 3. So I can't hard code in a selector. That means it needs to be dynamic, okay? So I'm going to create a variable, let's say let selected. I'm going to say equals document.querySelector. And I have to select something. So looking at my HTML, what I want to do is select the button, which is going to be common, that has a slot value that's going to be dynamic. Sometimes it's hotspot 1, sometimes it's hotspot 2. And then I want to select the div that immediately follows it. Okay? So it's going to look something like this. I'm going to use ES6 template literals. Okay? They are denoted by those tick marks. Okay? ES6 template literals make our life a hell of a lot easier when we're building out strings and trying to connect things. Okay? So what I'm going to do select the element that is a button, and that has a slot attribute that is equal to something. Okay? And I have to specify what that is. But again, I want it to be dynamic, because sometimes it's going to be button 1 or button 2 or whatever, hotspot 1, hotspot 2. So I'm going to drop in a dynamic variable. And I do so with the $ syntax and these mustache faces. And the value that I'm going to drop in is e.currentTarget.slot. Yep.
Does it matter which kind of quotes you use?
No, single quotes will work as well, yeah. And then I'm gonna say, immediately select the div that comes after that. So what that would look like when the string is actually built out is something like this. Button, slot, equals. Hotspot -4. Select the immediate div after that. So we're creating a dynamic query selector value. So sometimes this will be button slot equals hotspot 1, sometimes it'll be 2, sometimes it'll be 3. Target the immediate div after that. Okay. Okay, so what I'm going to do then is put GreenSock to use. And I'm going to say GSAP 2. So I'm going to use the to method of the GSAP library. What do I want to animate? Well, I want to animate whatever is referred to in this variable selected. So I'm going to say selected. And in 1 second, what CSS property do I want to animate? Well, in GreenSock syntax, we manipulate making something visible and adjusting its alpha value by using the property AutoAlpha. So I'm going to set the AutoAlpha at 1. Okay, and when I look at it in my browser window, it appears. It appears, but they don't disappear. Okay, so I have to write that functionality in. And really, it's just the opposite of what I've done here. So again, I'm going to collect the event object. I'm going to use this same variable here, selected. actually, I can even copy this. But this time, I'm gonna set it to 0. And when I look at it in my browser now, I get something like that. Yep,
Could this all have been done in CSS?
maybe. Sometimes things that we can do in CSS, we can do in JavaScript, or things that we can do in JavaScript, we can do in CSS. I'd have to sit and kind of think about it and figure it out, but it might be possible, yeah. Again, it just kind of comes down to what languages you're comfortable with, right? Okay, so since this got asked in my other class, I'm going to break this down a little bit further, okay? So again, they asked me, well, what are these tick marks, Marco? Why are we using them? Okay, they're ES6 template literals, is what they're called. They make combining strings easier, okay? And they also asked, well, what does the $sign and the curly brace mean? Well, let's take a look at that. So normally, when you write out a string the old way, it would look like this. Okay, so whatever you want to be text, you put inside of quotation marks, and again, they could be single or double. And if I wanted to drop in my name, I would have to add in a plus symbol, and then I could drop in the name variable. Okay, so that's old string syntax. Okay, so you can see, hello, my name is Marco, it's kind of mushed together. Now, if I wanted to write that same text using ES6 template literals, it would look something like this. 2 tick marks. Hello, my name is. And I don't need the plus sign. Instead, I use the $sign and name. And the thing about template literals too is they'll respect spacing, okay, whereas regular strings don't. Apparently I'm lying in that case, but you can still see the spaces are respected there. But again, where it becomes kind of like a pain is if I want to add another string, I have to add another plus symbol. Whereas if I'm doing it with a ES6 template literal, I just go back to writing regular text. And one of the other differences is that regular strings don't like being on multiple lines. Whereas a template literal don't care. So they are a more flexible and modern way of working with strings and concatenating or piecing together dynamic strings. And that is me going off on a tangent on ES6 template literals. Code-wise though, is there anything else I can explain or anything else that isn't making sense per se?
Can you just explain the green sock you're using here?
Explain the green sock?
Yeah, because you just understand.
Yep. So we are linking to the green sock library here, okay? Which means we have access to the entire green sock library. So down here, I'm using green sock. And the way that I typically use green sock is by starting with the object name GSAP, okay? And then from there, I specify what method I want to use. So in green sock, we have the to method, the from method, the from to method, to from method, okay? But basically what I'm saying is I want to animate this to be visible, okay? So I'm saying GSAP2, and the element that I'm animating is whatever's been selected. So let's say it's this one here. So selected is going to equate to the button with the slot, hotspot 4, and that particular div. So this is the thing that's going to be animated. It's going to be animated in 1 second, okay? And I pass in an object. Inside of the object, I can have a string of CSS properties. So I could animate the background color. I could animate whatever it is I want. In this case, I'm using a specific property from GreenSock called AutoAlpha. And what AutoAlpha does is it changes the visibility from hidden to visible, and it changes the opacity so that it shows, okay? Don't know if that helps or makes sense. And down here, we're just doing the opposite. We're saying when the user moves out, okay, select that same thing again, and in 1 second, change the AutoAlpha to 0, so it goes back to being hidden, and the opacity is set to 0. So, eventually, once I have some more time with Aiden, we're going to figure out a new timeline for your submission, okay? But what you're going to end up doing is taking your headphone models, exporting them out as a GLTF, and you're gonna go through the same process that we just went through in class, okay? And eventually it's gonna be part of a larger promo site. So you're gonna use a combination of CSS3 JavaScript and the Greensock library to animate the hotspots and display information just like we did. Except, I'm gonna up the ante, because you gotta challenge you, right? So instead of hard coding the information into the page like we just did, you're gonna use an array or an object or an array of objects to store all of that hotspot information, okay, and then populate it on the page, okay? And if you're freaking out about it, we'll kind of roughly cover it in class. I'm gonna give you some hints and some tips to doing it. You're also going to include an image in the hotspot as well, or sorry, an image in the info box as well. Okay. Now, you might be asking yourself again, what is with these arrays and these objects and pulling information from that? Why do you keep making us do that, Marco? There's a method to my madness, okay? Because eventually, we're gonna be getting into making AJAX calls. And eventually, we're gonna be communicating with APIs, okay? And what those APIs are gonna give us is objects, okay? And we're gonna use that to dynamically populate our pages. So I'm incrementally getting you there bit by bit, okay? But that's a little further down the road. So our end game is going to be for you to build a site like this, okay? And when you're done your earbuds, okay, Aiden and I are going to work with you. You're going to export them out as individual still frames, and we're going to learn how to do one of these scrolling-based animations on a web page. Yep.
How can we improve the loading? As when you loading, we can see some offering.
Say that again.
It's a bit slow.
It's a bit slow.
Yeah, you see some lagging.
Okay. What we're seeing right here.
Yeah, a little.
I mean, yeah, it comes down to a combination of things. How many frames you have, how quick you're scrolling. You're gonna see a little lag between my computer and the projector, okay? How optimized your images are they WebP, are they massive JPEG, right? So there are some things that we can do to optimize that for sure, yeah? All right, so there'll be that. You'll see the student, custom icons, text, image. That's eventually what you're working towards. I'm also going to teach you how to do one of these 3D views. So again, Aiden will work with you to export out these still frames. So one that's textured, one that's kind of got the guts. Okay, another example here. Here's your little widget. And here's their custom model. Show you one more example. Okay, so that is our end goal. That's where we're gonna get to, okay? But yeah, you kinda need an earbud model to get there, so that'll be your next step. So that is it for me for today, okay? If you have any questions about your upcoming assignments, okay, make sure that you're in touch. And I'm just gonna help Aiden get set up here and we'll get moving. If you want, you can leave and come back at 12, up to you, but yeah, at 12 o'clock, the show will begin.